Alrighty, boys and girls, time for Chapter 9, Section 2, Theoretical and Experimental Probability. Let's take a look at our vocab. Theoretical probability is what should happen. It's what you expect to happen. We learned about this in the last section, Chapter 9, Section 1. So for example, when you flip a coin, you expect it to land on tails 1 out of 2 times, half the time, 50% of the time. Why? Because one side is tails and there's 2 sides on a coin. That's theoretical probability. Experimental probability is what happened when you actually tried it. When you actually flipped the coin, whether or not you got heads or tails. Or if you flipped it 20 times, how many times did you get heads or tails? And usually the theoretical and experimental probability are not the same. Almost always. Let's take a look at an example. Okay, so a coin is tossed 20 times. 8 of those times it lands on heads. What are the experimental and theoretical probabilities of landing on heads? Most of these questions you'll see will be word problems just like this. Sometimes they'll have charts, sometimes they won't. So, let's write down our probabilities. First, let's start with theoretical. One side of a coin is heads out of 2 sides. So the theoretical probability is 1/2. During the experiment, it landed on heads 8 times out of 20 attempts. 8 out of 20. Now, we can reduce this to 4 over 10, and that reduces to 2/5. Now, 1/2 would be 0.5 or 50%, and in the experiment, 2/5 would be 0.4 or 40%. And you can see that our experimental probability was close to our theoretical probability, but they're not exactly the same. Now, usually, the more you do the experiment, the closer your experimental probability is to the theoretical probability. It's not always that way, but usually that's the way it is. Now, let's talk about predictions based on probabilities. We can use a theoretical and or an experimental probability to make a prediction about about populations, and we do this with cross products. I'll show you an example of what I mean. So, let's say last year 230 of the 500 7th graders sneezed in class. This year there are 650 7th graders. Predict how many will sneeze. Well, let's take a look. What we know from last year is 230 out of the 500 sneezed last year. What we want to know is how many out of the 650 we have this year will sneeze. What we're going to do is we're going to write these two ratios so that they're equal, and we're going to use cross products to solve for x, to solve for how many out of the 650 will sneeze. Now, we solved this problem using cross products, and that goes all the way back to Chapter 1, Lesson 6. Take a look. So, 299 is what we will expect. Specifically, 299 out of the 650 students will expect to sneeze this year. Alright, hopefully you have a good handle on this, and I will have another video with extra practice problems if you need that as well.